I promise this is the last video that I have planned about the Steam Deck. I think. I make no promises. There might be another one, but at least for now, nothing else is planned. And it is clear that I do not care about native binaries when it comes to gaming, because a lot of the time what you see is really lazy ports. And in my mind, a lazy port that is worse than just playing it through Proton is honestly worse than just being no port altogether. A proper port requires skilled development, someone who actually understands both Linux and Windows development. It requires a lot of testing, it requires more development, more testing, and a lot of money. And this is something that a lot of companies just don't bother to do. And it turns out that Valve may not really care either. So this was posted over on Twitter by Ethan Lee, who isn't just some random person who has no connection to the game industry. Ethan Lee has one of, if not the longest careers in getting games ported to Linux. He's been involved in getting things like Fez, Transistor, Celeste, and a bunch of other games ported. What he had to say is, if you've released a Linux version of your game on Steam and are directly approached by Valve about using Proton instead, please get in touch. They've already done this a few times, but I would like to see how aggressive they're going to be going forward. And then combining that with some of the material on the Steam Deck website, it comes with Proton, a compatibility layer that makes it possible to run your games without any porting work needed from developers. For Deck, we're vastly improving Proton's game compatibility and support for anti-cheat solutions by working directly with the vendors, along with something in the FAQ where it says, do I need to port my game to Linux to have it work on the Steam Deck? No porting is necessary. Your Windows build will likely work right out of the box thanks to Proton. And if you combine all of this information together, what you can basically infer is that Valve doesn't really care about Linux native gaming either. Now, some people have sort of extrapolated this out further to say that Valve is going to kill off Linux native binaries. I find that hard to believe. What I find more likely is that Valve just isn't going to encourage them. From what I've seen, I don't believe Valve has actually released a public statement explaining what exactly is going on. All we've seen is some rumors here and there from certain game developers who've released their games on Linux. And Gaming on Linux was sort of just as confused as I was. They had to say, I don't really get why they would do that. It only increases their support burden with Proton, and if the Linux port works well, it's just pointless. And while I said I don't care about Linux native binaries, I play Celeste as the native binary, and there's a couple other games I do play native. If the game is available native and it works well, sure, I'll play the native version. If you're going to make a native port and you're going to make it well, I'm not going to stop you from doing that, I just won't encourage it. If, however, you're going to make something really lazy, you're just going to hit the export button inside of Unity and not go and test it and optimize it for Linux, simply don't bother. Now, let's assume the worst or maybe the best case scenario, depending on where you're actually looking at it from. And that is that Valve just simply doesn't care about native binaries and they even want to kill them off. Why would they be doing this before the launch of the Steam Deck? Wouldn't it make more sense to have more Linux native games rather than just, like, relying on Proton? Well, there's a couple of reasons why they might not want to do that. The first reason is it is very expensive for developers to maintain multiple runtimes. When you port a game, it's just like porting any other piece of software. You can't just go and release it once and then be done with it. Let's say you're going to have some content patches or security patches, so you have to release those for the Windows version and the Linux version, and there's going to be some modifications you need to actually make. And you need to make sure the game actually keeps working on future versions of the operating system. Maybe something changes in Linux that you're relying on, and that completely breaks the game. Well, you have to now go and update the Linux version to make sure it continues to work. And for games that are 5, 10 years old, that can be a really big problem. While game engines certainly abstract away the process and make it so it is easier than having to go and write everything by yourself, it doesn't do everything for you. And if you want to have the game available on Windows and on Linux, you're probably going to maintain 2 versions of the graphics API. You're probably going to have a DirectX version available on Windows, and then a Vulkan version available on Linux. Now, Vulkan does work on Windows, but you're probably going to be using DirectX on Windows. That's what most projects typically do. Maintaining just one of these versions can be incredibly expensive. Maintaining both of them, especially when one of them is for an operating system that has a very, very tiny user base. Let's just imagine a number. Let's say your Linux users is 100th of what you have on Windows. When there is that much of a disparity, it's really hard to justify spending that much money because it's not going to be cheaper maintaining it for Linux. It's going to cost basically as much. That's a really hard justification for a company to actually make. I've seen mutterings saying that maybe Valve is going to start offering incentives to get developers to start getting games to work well inside of Proton rather than releasing a native binary, but I don't think Valve even needs to do this because all Valve needs to say is your game's going to work well if there is a Windows build. That's what they were going to make anyway. Valve doesn't need to offer anything extra, and the native binary is just a cost that doesn't need to be made. If Valve wants the Steam Deck to succeed, which everything I've seen about it indicates to me they do want that, Valve needs to make sure that playing a game is going to be a seamless experience, as seamless as, say, picking up a game for my PS4, throwing it in the console, and it just works. I shouldn't have to go and, like, fiddle around with different Proton versions, or swap out from the native version to the Proton version, or maybe try out some wine settings. I shouldn't have to do that. I should just be able to play the game, and it works. And I think this is going to be fundamental to making the console succeed. And Steam is full of really bad ports. Some of the ports weren't even bad when they came out. Things like Borderlands 2 have just been abandoned. And when you have a port that's been abandoned, basically it's just going to rot further and further as time goes on. This will lead to things like poor performance, crashing, maybe you're going to even have like incompatible multiplayer, and all of these things are going to hurt the Steam Deck adoption. Because by default, if there is a native version available, Steam is going to default to running the native version. Now that can be changed in the Steam settings, but I guarantee to you right now, most people are not going to even know those settings exist, especially if they've come from Windows. And every port is eventually going to be abandoned. Even ports for massive games that work absolutely perfectly, things like, say, Counter-Strike Go. One day, it will be abandoned. I don't know when, maybe it'll be like 20 or 30 years from now, but it will eventually be abandoned, and there's nothing you can do about that because it's just a binary. You can't go and modify that yourself. Game studios typically have a really high churn rate, so by the time that this abandonment actually becomes a problem, the people that were working on it probably have long left the company. Now, I know I've said this multiple times, but Valve has stated they are working with BattlEye and EAC to bring anti-cheat support into Proton. What they haven't mentioned is support for this anti-cheat under Linux native titles. And I think that's entirely on purpose. I don't think they're working on getting it working with native. I think they are just working on it inside of Proton. And I feel like this is also going to be true for the other pain points that exist with Linux, like the various forms of DRM that don't play nicely with it. They're probably only going to be bringing support inside of Proton. If my hypothesis is correct, this would make porting certain games actually impossible. Even if the developers wanted to actually do so, it just couldn't be done. Things like, say, Apex Legends. Even if the anti-cheat worked perfectly fine under Proton, if it didn't work under native, well, you're basically stuck now. Now, when it comes to Proton, I really do hope Valve has some hidden patches they just haven't released yet, because if they're going to be making claims like this, Valve promises the Steam Deck will run the entire Steam library at 30 plus FPS. If they're going to be making claims like that, I really hope Proton does improve, because while it works really well, like most of the games I want to play work basically as well as I want them to play. Things like, say, the Persona 5 Strikers literally doesn't work. And while all of the Neptunia games do work, some of them don't work as well as they possibly could. Some of them only have a silver rating. Silver is perfectly playable, but in the case of, say, Mega Tag Mention, that only has a bronze rating. Hyper Devotion only has a bronze rating, and bronze is it crashes a bit, but you can still play it. And by having problems like that, it is really going to affect how much people actually like this console. You can say, oh, but people will just install Windows on it and it will work perfectly fine. Yes, you might install Windows on it. But how many people do you know, especially just random normies out there, who go and buy a Switch and then jailbreak it? If you say any more than like a couple of them, I think you're going to be lying. And something else Valve has talked about doing is having this ability to basically suspend the game on your PC and then pick it up on the Steam Deck and take off from basically where you left off. That is something that I don't think would even be remotely possible if you were doing that with different binaries, unless the game was made absolutely perfectly to make those save states work exactly the same way on both versions. I find that hard to believe, though. The only way you could feasibly do this is through having the same binary. Maybe there are other ways it could be done, but I certainly don't see them myself. If there is a bad Linux port and a Windows version, like, I don't think there's any way that Valve can magically make that function. While I can certainly empathize with Ethan, the fact that his career as a Linux game porter might be on the line and more companies just won't see Linux porting as a thing they should even consider, I still don't think that Linux native gaming really matters. I think that Proton is going to be the absolute key that makes the Steam Deck succeed. And not having Proton was what killed the Steam machines. Not having games that people wanted to play was the reason nobody bought them. Why would you buy a console that doesn't have any games you want to play? Maybe you disagree with me and think that Linux native gaming is the only thing you should support. And if you want to do that, that's fine by me. I'm happy to have a discussion in the comment section. You're probably just not going to change my mind. I've been enlightened to this path by HexDSL. Unless you can make a more compelling argument that he's made, I don't really know what to say to you. However, if you like this video and you like to support the channel and become one of these amazing people over here, please go check out my Patreon, LibrePay, Subscribestar. I don't know how to say that name. I just keep saying it differently every single time. Linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays where I live stream twice a week and upload about 5 or so YouTube shorts. And I've got this channel available over on Odyssey. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.